Tonight we step into a world where beauty masks death, where delicate white flowers conceal one of nature's most efficient killers. This is the story of a plant that has shaped the course of human history, silencing the greatest mind of ancient Athens and becoming the chosen instrument of executioners, assassins, and fate itself. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone on silent, lights low. Let's begin. The Green Death. In the summer months, along roadsides and ditches, in damp meadows, and at the edges of cultivated fields, a plant grows. To the untrained eye, it might seem innocent, even lovely. White flowers arranged in delicate umbrella-shaped clusters, reaching skyward on hollow stems that can tower to 8 or even 10 feet tall. The leaves are finely divided, almost fern-like, bright green and lacy. It could be mistaken for a dozen other members of the carrot family. Wild parsnip perhaps. Queen Anne's lace. Something harmless, something edible. But look closer. Run your fingers down the stem, and you'll feel it smooth, hairless, and notice something else. Purple. Deep reddish-purple blotches and streaks staining the hollow tubes like dried blood. The markings of Cain, according to ancient English legend. The brand placed upon the first murderer's brow. Break a leaf or crush a bit of stem, and a smell emerges. Not pleasant. Musty fetid. Some describe it as mouse-like. Others say it reeks of rotting vegetation. Your nose recoils, warning you of something fundamentally wrong. This is not food. This is not medicine, despite what desperate people throughout history have hoped. This is Conium maculatum, poison hemlock, one of the most toxic plants in the northern hemisphere, and every part of it wants to kill you. The danger lies in the chemistry. Within those innocent-looking tissues, a cocktail of piperidine alkaloids courses through the plant's vascular system. Conium is the chief assassin, accounting for 90% of the plant's lethal potential. But it brings accomplices: gamma-coniceine, methylconiine, conhydrine, pseudoconhydrin. Each one a variation on the same molecular theme. Each one a poison. These alkaloids are volatile, especially when the plant is young and fresh. They evaporate in sunlight, disperse in air, break down when dried or cooked. This volatility has led to confusion throughout history. Ancient texts describe hemlock sometimes as a cold poison, bringing on a gradual, peaceful paralysis, and sometimes as a hot poison, causing convulsions and terrible suffering. The truth is both accounts were accurate. Different plants, different preparations, different species altogether. For while poison hemlock is deadly, its cousin water hemlock is arguably worse. Cicuta virosa and Cicuta maculata, the water hemlocks, contain cicutoxin, a compound so violent in its action that victims die screaming and convulsing, backs arched, mouths foaming. This is not the quiet death of Socrates. This is agony. The two plants have been confused for millennia, their names interchangeable in ancient texts, leading to scholarly debates that continue to this day. But it is Conium maculatum, the poison hemlock of the ancient Greeks, that concerns us. And its method of killing is both elegant and horrifying. The alkaloids work by mimicking and then blocking the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. They fit into the nicotinic receptors at neuromuscular junctions, those critical points where nerve meets muscle. At first, they stimulate. The victim experiences a rush, nervous energy, heightened awareness, heart racing, pupils dilating, saliva flowing. The body, sensing danger, tries to respond. But then the blockade takes hold. The alkaloids occupy the receptor sites, but fail to transmit the proper signals. The nerve impulses from brain to muscle are severed. And so the paralysis begins. Not all at once. Gradually. Ascending. Starting at the extremities, creeping inward. Your toes go numb. Then your feet. The cold sensation climbs up your calves. Your legs grow heavy, unresponsive. You cannot stand. Your fingers tingle, then nothing. Your arms hang useless at your sides. The paralysis climbs through your torso. Your breathing muscles, the diaphragm that has pumped air into your lungs every moment of your life without conscious thought, begins to falter. Each breath comes harder, shallower, and throughout this entire process, unless you are very fortunate or very unfortunate, depending on your perspective, your mind remains clear, crystal clear. You are fully conscious as your body systematically shuts down. You feel the paralysis spreading. You know what is happening. You understand that death is approaching, creeping up from your numb feet toward your stuttering heart, and you are helpless to stop it. This is how hemlock kills. Not with fire or blade, not with a violent disruption of organs. It simply disconnects you from your own body, piece by piece, until the last essential connection fails and the lights go out forever. A lethal dose for an adult human is surprisingly small. 100 milligrams of coniine. About 6 to 8 fresh leaves, carefully consumed. A smaller amount of the seeds, even less of the root, where the alkaloids concentrate most heavily. Children are far more vulnerable. A single root mistaken for wild carrot can be fatal to a child, and there is no antidote. None. No chemical that can reverse coniine's grip on those receptor sites. No magic medicine to flush it from your system. The only treatment is supportive care. Keep the airway open. Provide mechanical ventilation if needed, forcing air into lungs whose muscles can no longer perform their ancient duty. Wait. Hope. Pray that the dose was not quite lethal, that the body can metabolize and excrete the poison before it completes its deadly work. If you survive the first 48 to 72 hours, you will likely live. The poison does not accumulate. It does not hide in tissues waiting to strike again. It does its work, and then, if you are lucky, it leaves. But during those critical days, you are entirely at the mercy of the plant. This has been understood, in one form or another, for thousands of years. Long before chemistry could explain the mechanism, long before alkaloids were isolated and named, humans knew that this plant brought death. They gave it names that reflected their understanding. The ancient Greeks called it konos, meaning to whirl, for the vertigo it induced. The Romans knew it as cicuta. Medieval Europeans called it death's herb, and they used it, deliberately, for medicine when they dared, for murder when they could, for execution when the state demanded it. This is a plant that has walked through human history, leaving bodies in its wake. From the earliest Greek city-states to modern-day emergency rooms, hemlock has been killing. It killed criminals and philosophers. It killed emperors and slaves. It killed children who didn't know any better and adults who knew too much. It killed accidentally and intentionally, as medicine and as poison, in war and in peace. And it all began, or at least entered the permanent record of Western consciousness, on a spring day in Athens in the year 399 BC, when an old man with a face like a satyr drank a cup of poison and became immortal. Ancient whispers. The story of hemlock is far older than Socrates, far older than Athens, far older than philosophy itself. It stretches back into the mists of prehistory, into times when writing did not yet exist to record humanity's bitter lessons. Imagine early humans in the Mediterranean basin, tens of thousands of years ago. They were foragers, experimenters by necessity. Every plant was a potential food source or a potential killer, and the only way to learn which involved the terrible mathematics of trial and error. Some experiments ended in full bellies. Others ended in graves. We know from archaeological evidence that ancient peoples understood toxic plants. Cave paintings and later artifacts suggest a sophisticated knowledge of poisons used for hunting. Arrow points were coated with substances derived from plants, making even a glancing wound potentially fatal to prey. This required careful observation, meticulous experimentation, and the passing down of knowledge from generation to generation. Hemlock would have been encountered early. It grows readily in disturbed soils, in the same environments where early agricultural communities flourished. Its resemblance to edible members of the carrot family, its tantalizing white root that looks so much like a parsnip, its foliage that could be mistaken for parsley. These similarities would have led to mistakes. Fatal mistakes that became warnings, warnings that became taboos, taboos that became knowledge. By the time we have written records, Hemlock's toxicity was already ancient wisdom. The Sumerians, those remarkable inventors of writing and civilization, cultivating their fields between the Tigris and Euphrates around 3000 BC, knew of poisonous plants. Their medical texts, inscribed on clay tablets, reference substances used both for healing and for harming. While hemlock is not explicitly named in surviving Sumerian texts, the plant was native to the region, and it is almost certain they encountered it. The ancient Egyptians, whose medical knowledge was legendary throughout the ancient world, documented a wide range of plant-based medicines in texts like the Ebers Papyrus. They understood poisons well. Their embalmers used toxic substances to preserve bodies. Their physicians used carefully measured doses of dangerous plants to treat illness. And their assassins, we can be certain, knew which plants to avoid mentioning in official records. But it is with the ancient Greeks that hemlock steps fully into the light of history. And it does so not as a medicine or a tool, but as an instrument of the state, a method of execution reserved for citizens of Athens. The ancient Greek world had many forms of execution. Crucifixion was known, though considered barbaric and rarely used on citizens. Stoning was reserved for the worst offenders, a communal act of violence that satisfied the city's need for blood. Throwing condemned criminals from the Tarpeian Rock or into a chasm was dramatic but impractical in flat Athens. Beheading was quick but messy. For citizens guilty of crimes deserving death, but not public spectacle, Athens chose something different. Something that maintained a veneer of civility, that allowed the condemned a measure of dignity in their final moments, that could be performed in private without the stain of visible blood. Athens chose the cup. The process was ritualized, formal, almost clinical. The condemned would be held in the state prison, a modest building whose ruins still stand today at the base of the Areopagus. When the time came, usually at sunset, the jailer would arrive with a cup. Inside was a draft prepared according to precise specifications. Fresh hemlock leaves, or perhaps the seeds, or the root, ground and mixed with liquid. Water, most likely, though some ancient accounts suggest wine was sometimes added to mask the taste and ease the drinking. The poison would have been prepared by a specialist, someone who understood dosages and timing. Too little, and the prisoner would suffer a prolonged, agonizing death. Too much, paradoxically, might cause violent convulsions rather than the desired peaceful paralysis. The preparation had to be exactly right. The condemned would take the cup. There was no forcing, no violence. To accept the cup, to drink it willingly, was part of the ritual. It transformed execution into something that almost resembled voluntary departure, a citizen's final act of obedience to the city that had condemned them. And then they would drink. The taste, as we know from historical accounts and modern analysis, would not have been pleasant. Bitter. Acrid. The smell alone would have warned the body of danger. But once consumed, the process was irreversible. For the first 15 or 20 minutes, nothing much would happen. Perhaps a slight burning sensation in the mouth and throat. A hint of nausea. Some victims would pace nervously, as if movement could delay what was coming. Others would sit quietly, gathering their thoughts, saying final words to friends and family allowed to attend. And then the numbness would begin. The execution of hemlock was not instantaneous like a blade to the neck. It was gradual, measured in heartbeats and breaths. The poison worked its way through the body, systematically, predictably. Feet first, then legs, then the trunk. The condemned could feel death approaching, could measure its progress, could know precisely how much time remained. This characteristic progressive paralysis made hemlock unique among ancient poisons. It killed slowly enough that final words could be spoken, final affairs could be settled, final philosophies could be articulated. It killed gently enough that the condemned did not thrash or scream or soil themselves, preserving the dignity that Athens valued even in execution. But make no mistake, this gentleness was an illusion. The agony of hemlock is not physical, but psychological. Imagine knowing that your death is certain, feeling it creeping through your limbs, being fully conscious as your body becomes a tomb that you cannot escape. The mental torture of that awareness, the sheer existential horror of conscious paralysis, is perhaps worse than any physical pain. The ancient Greeks understood this. They chose hemlock not despite its cruel nature, but because of it. It was punishment and spectacle combined, a death that allowed time for regret, time for reflection, time for the condemned to contemplate exactly what they had done to earn such a fate. Records from ancient Athens mention several executions by hemlock. Phocion, an Athenian general and statesman, was condemned to death in 318 BC on charges of treason. He drank the hemlock with stoic resignation, though historical accounts mention that the first cup proved insufficient and a second had to be prepared. The executioner initially refused to make more unless he was paid 12 drachmas for the additional poison. Phocion's friends scrambled to gather the money, adding a final indignity to an already tragic death. Theophrastus, one of the 30 tyrants who briefly ruled Athens in 404 BC, was forced to drink hemlock when he fell out of favor with his fellow oligarchs. According to legend, he toasted his executioners with the cup, showing the same dark wit that had marked his political career. These men, and others whose names have been lost to time, all ended their lives the same way. In a small room, with a cup, with hemlock, waiting for the paralysis to reach their hearts. But of all the thousands who surely died this way, only one death was recorded in such detail, with such philosophical weight, that it became one of the most famous deaths in all of human history. Only one death made hemlock immortal: the death of Socrates. The year is 399 BC. Athens has seen better days. The great city that defeated the Persian Empire, that built the Parthenon, that pioneered democracy and philosophy and drama, is exhausted. 27 years of brutal warfare against Sparta have ended in total defeat. The Peloponnesian War, that grinding, generation-long conflict, concluded just 5 years earlier with the humiliation of Athens. The Spartan fleet sailed into Piraeus harbor. The long walls that protected the city were torn down to the music of flutes, the Spartans celebrating what they called a day of freedom for Greece. But freedom is a complicated word. In the aftermath of defeat, Sparta installed a puppet government in Athens. 30 men, chosen for their anti-democratic sympathies, were given absolute power. They became known as the 30 Tyrants, and they used their brief 8-month reign to settle old scores, confiscate property, and execute opponents. 1,500 people died during that dark period, their bodies thrown into mass graves outside the city walls. The democracy was eventually restored, but Athens was not the same. The population was bitter, frightened, looking for scapegoats. Old certainties had collapsed. The gods who were supposed to protect Athens had failed. The leaders who promised victory had led them to defeat. The youth who should have become the next generation of citizens had been killed in battle or corrupted by the chaos of endless war. Into this wounded, paranoid city, an old man walked each day, stopping citizens on the streets and in the marketplace, asking them questions they could not answer. His name was Socrates. He was 70 years old, by ancient standards practically elderly. His appearance was notorious throughout Athens. He was ugly by the standards of the day, barrel-shaped with a pot belly, bulging eyes, a flat upturned nose. He looked, people said, like a satyr from a ribald comedy. He walked barefoot in all weather, wore the same shabby cloak year-round, and seemed oblivious to physical comfort or conventional propriety. But his mind was another matter entirely. Socrates claimed no special knowledge. In fact, he insisted that the only thing he knew was that he knew nothing. But he had a method, a way of asking questions that revealed the ignorance and inconsistency in others. He would approach someone, usually a person of importance or reputation, and engage them in conversation. A general might be asked to define courage. A religious official might be asked to explain piety. A politician might be asked to define justice. And then the questions would begin. Simple questions at first. Can you give me an example? Does that work in every case? What about this situation? And slowly, methodically, Socrates would demonstrate that the person who claimed expertise actually understood nothing at all. Their confident assertions would unravel. Their definitions would contradict themselves. Their certainty would dissolve into confusion. This method of philosophical inquiry, the dialectic, would become the foundation of Western philosophy. But in the Athens of 399 BC, to the proud men who found themselves publicly humiliated by this ugly, barefoot questioner, it felt more like assault. Socrates gathered followers. Young men, mostly. The sons of wealthy families who should have been learning rhetoric and politics, preparing to take their place in Athenian society. Instead, they followed this strange old man around, watching him dismantle the pretensions of their elders, learning to question authority and think critically about traditional beliefs. Some of these followers would become famous in their own right. Plato would go on to found the Academy and write dialogues that preserve Socrates' teachings. Xenophon would become a historian and soldier. Alcibiades, that charismatic disaster of a man, was associated with Socrates before his multiple betrayals of Athens. And Critias, one of the most brutal of the 30 tyrants, had been among Socrates' circle. This last connection would prove fatal. Athenians remembered that Critias had spent time with Socrates. They remembered that Alcibiades, who defected to Sparta and then to Persia, betraying Athens twice, had been influenced by Socrates' teachings. They looked at this old man who questioned everything, who encouraged the youth to think for themselves rather than accepting traditional wisdom, and they saw danger. In the spring of 399 BC, 3 men brought charges against Socrates before the Athenian courts. The accusers were Meletus, a young poet, Anytus, a successful tanner and politician, and Lyco, an orator. Their names would become footnotes to history, remembered only because of whom they accused. The charges were twofold. First, that Socrates was guilty of impiety, of not believing in the gods recognized by the state, and of introducing new divinities. Second, that he corrupted the youth of Athens. These charges were carefully crafted. An amnesty declared after the fall of the 30 tyrants meant that Socrates could not be directly accused of political crimes. But impiety and corrupting the youth were offenses that could be prosecuted, and they were serious enough to carry the death penalty. The trial took place in the spring, likely in April. The venue was a large open court in the Agora, the marketplace at the heart of Athens. 501 jurors heard the case, a large number even by Athenian standards. They were citizens chosen by lot, ordinary men of Athens ranging from young to old, poor to wealthy. They would listen to the accusations and to Socrates' defense, and then they would vote. The accusers spoke first. They had 3 hours, measured by a water clock, to make their case. Their speeches have not survived, but we can imagine their content based on the charges and the historical context. They would have pointed to Socrates' questioning of traditional beliefs about the gods. They would have mentioned his claim to have a daimonion, an inner voice or divine sign that guided him, which could be interpreted as introducing a new deity. They would have cited his most infamous students, Critias and Alcibiades, as evidence that his teachings led to treachery and tyranny. And then it was Socrates' turn. He stood before the 501 jurors, this ugly old man who had walked the streets of Athens for 7 decades, and he did not beg. He did not weep. He did not plead for mercy or soften his words. Instead, he gave what Plato would later call an apology, though the word means defense, not regret. Socrates told the jurors that he was not skilled at courtroom oratory. He would speak plainly, he said, in the language of the marketplace where he had spent his life. He denied the charges of impiety, insisting that he had always honored the gods. He explained his daimonion as merely an internal intuition, a voice of conscience that warned him away from mistakes, but never told him what to do. As for corrupting the youth, Socrates turned the question around, as he always did. Who in Athens, he asked, actively teaches virtue? Who intentionally makes the young better citizens? The politicians? They disagree about everything. The poets? They themselves don't understand their own works. The craftsmen? They know their crafts, but presume this makes them wise about all things. Socrates argued that he was not a teacher at all. He took no fees, unlike the sophists. He made no claims to wisdom. He simply asked questions, exposing ignorance and encouraging people to think for themselves. If this was corruption, then Athens was built on corruption, for what was democracy but the assumption that citizens could think for themselves and reach sound conclusions? But then Socrates made a series of statements that ensured his conviction. He compared himself to a gadfly, stinging the sluggish horse of Athens to keep it alert and awake. He suggested that far from deserving death, he deserved to be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, the highest honor Athens could bestow, the same honor given to Olympic victors. He told the jurors that if they killed him, they would have trouble finding another person to keep them from falling into complacency and error. It was brilliant philosophy. It was terrible legal strategy. The jurors voted. 380 found him guilty. 221 voted for acquittal. It was not a landslide, but it was decisive. Under Athenian law, when a person was found guilty of a capital crime, there were two phases to the trial. The prosecution would propose a punishment, and then the defendant could propose an alternative. The jurors would then vote on which punishment to implement. The accusers proposed death. Socrates could have proposed exile. He could have suggested a fine. He could have begged, as was customary, bringing his wife and children forward to weep before the jurors and arouse their pity. Many scholars believe that if Socrates had done this, if he had shown even the slightest contrition or humility, he would have been sentenced to exile or a fine rather than death. Instead, he proposed that he be maintained at public expense. When the jurors reacted with outrage to this suggestion, Socrates adjusted slightly. After consulting with his friends, including Plato and Crito, he suggested a fine of 1 mina of silver, about 1/5 of his modest net worth. His friends offered to increase this to 30 minae, a substantial sum they would pay on his behalf. But the damage was done. The jurors saw defiance, not contrition. They voted again. This time the margin was wider. 360 voted for death. Only 140 voted for the fine. Socrates had secured his own execution. According to Plato's account, Socrates received the verdict calmly. He told the jurors that death was not to be feared, for it was either like a dreamless sleep, perfectly peaceful, or it was a transition to another life where he could converse with the dead heroes and gods. Either way, he said, it was not evil. He also warned them. You think, he told the jurors, that by killing me you will prevent criticism of your way of life. But you are wrong. My students will continue my work, and they will be even harsher in their criticism because they are younger and less gentle than I am. It was a prophecy that would prove accurate. The execution should have been carried out quickly, within a day or two of sentencing. But Athens had a problem. The day before Socrates' trial, the city had sent its sacred ship, a vessel that carried an annual tribute to the island of Delos to honor the god Apollo, on its yearly voyage. During the voyage of the sacred ship, which could take a month or more, depending on winds and weather, no executions could be performed in Athens. The city had to remain pure. So Socrates sat in prison for 30 days, waiting for a ship to return. During that month, his friends and students visited him daily. They discussed philosophy. They tried to comfort him, and they offered him escape. Crito, his oldest and closest friend, came to him one night with a plan. He had bribed the guards. He had arranged for safe passage to Thessaly, where Socrates would be welcomed and protected. All Socrates had to do was walk out of the prison. The guards would look the other way. By morning, he could be far from Athens, beginning a new life in exile. Socrates refused. His reasoning, preserved in Plato's dialogue Crito, became one of the foundational arguments for the rule of law. He told Crito that he had lived his entire life in Athens, benefiting from its laws, its protection, its culture. He had implicitly agreed to abide by those laws by choosing to remain in the city. To break them now, to escape from a legally imposed sentence, would be to betray everything he believed in. The laws were not always just, Socrates acknowledged. His own trial had perhaps been unjust. But the system of laws itself was necessary for civilization. If individuals could pick and choose which laws to obey based on personal convenience, there would be no law at all, only chaos. Better to die unjustly under the law than to live as a lawbreaker. Crito wept, but Socrates was unmoved. Finally, on a spring morning in late April or early May of 399 BC, word came that the sacred ship had been sighted off Cape Saunion. It would arrive in Athens by evening. The execution could proceed. Socrates spent his last day in philosophical discussion with his students. They talked about the immortality of the soul, about the nature of death, about the possibility of an afterlife. It was simultaneously a farewell and a final lesson, a demonstration of how a philosopher should face the end of life, with curiosity and calm rather than fear. As the sun began to set, the jailer entered the cell. According to Plato's account in the Phaedo, the jailer was uncomfortable. He had come to like Socrates over the past 30 days. He apologized for what he had to do, explaining that he was simply following orders. He praised Socrates as the noblest and gentlest man who had ever been held in that prison. Socrates comforted the jailer, telling him not to mourn, but to prepare the poison. The jailer left and returned a few minutes later with a cup. Inside was the hemlock, prepared according to the specifications we can only guess at. Fresh leaves, most likely ground and mixed with liquid, enough to kill a man, but not so much as to cause violent convulsions. Socrates took the cup without hesitation. His friends and students, who had been maintaining composure throughout the day, began to weep. Xanthippe, Socrates' wife, had been sent home earlier because her sobbing disturbed the philosophical discussion. Now the men who remained broke down. Socrates chided them gently. He had sent the women away, so there would be no unseemly emotional displays, he said. He told his friends to be quiet and maintain their composure. This was not a tragedy, but a natural conclusion, a release of the soul from the prison of the body. And then he drank. Plato's description of what followed is clinical, almost medical in its precision. At first, Socrates walked around the cell, as the attendant who administered the poison had instructed. He paced until his legs began to feel heavy. Then he lay down on his back, as directed. The attendant, described as someone experienced in such matters, examined Socrates periodically. He would pinch or press different parts of the body, asking if Socrates felt anything. The numbness started in the feet. Socrates could no longer feel his toes. The attendant explained that when the coldness reached the heart, death would occur. The paralysis crept upward. Feet, ankles, calves. Socrates reported each stage calmly, almost with scientific interest. His legs grew cold and stiff. The sensation, or lack of sensation, moved to his thighs. Throughout all of this, Socrates remained conscious and articulate. He continued to speak with his students. His mind was as sharp as ever, even as his body systematically shut down. When the paralysis reached his abdomen, Socrates spoke his last words. He called to Crito and said, "We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt." It was a strange final statement, one that has puzzled scholars for 2 millennia. Asclepius was the god of healing, and it was customary to sacrifice a rooster to him upon recovering from illness. Some interpret Socrates' words as a final joke, suggesting that death was a cure for the illness of life. Others see it as a genuine religious observance, Socrates honoring his obligations even in his final moments. Still others find in it deeper philosophical meaning about the separation of soul from body. Crito promised to pay the debt. He asked if there was anything else. Socrates did not answer. The paralysis had reached his chest. His breathing, which had been growing shallower, stopped. The attendant checked for signs of life. He uncovered Socrates' face, which had been covered by a cloth, and closed the staring eyes. The philosopher's body made a final involuntary movement, a shudder that Crito witnessed with renewed grief. Socrates was dead. He was 70 years old. He had lived through the golden age of Athens and its decline. He had fought in the city's wars. He had raised children. He had spent decades in the marketplace, talking to anyone who would listen, questioning everything, seeking wisdom that always remained just out of reach. And now he was gone, killed by the very city he had spent his life trying to improve, by the very democracy he had defended, executed with the very method of death that had claimed countless others before him. But unlike those others, Socrates' death would not be forgotten. His student Plato would ensure that. The dialogues Plato wrote, especially the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo, would preserve not just the facts of Socrates' death, but its meaning. They would transform an execution into a philosophical statement, a death into a symbol. Socrates became the first martyr of philosophy, the first person to die for the principle of free inquiry, for the right to question authority and seek truth. His death demonstrated that ideas are dangerous enough to kill for and important enough to die for. And hemlock, the plant that ended his life, became forever associated with that moment. It was no longer just a poison. It became the poison that killed Socrates. It became the plant that silenced the greatest mind of the ancient world. It became part of history, the classical poison. But Socrates, despite his fame, was not the first to die by hemlock, nor would he be the last. The plant had been Athens' chosen method of execution long before that spring day in 399 BC, and it would continue to be used for years afterward. The ancient sources are frustratingly vague about when Athens first adopted hemlock as its official method of execution. The practice seems to have been well established by the late 5th century BC, suggesting it began sometime in the previous century or earlier. Unlike crucifixion or stoning, which were loud, public, and visceral, hemlock offered something different. It was quiet. It was relatively clean. Most importantly, it could be administered to citizens without violating the cultural taboos against directly shedding the blood of a fellow Athenian. This distinction mattered deeply in ancient Greek culture. To physically attack a citizen, to strike them or execute them in a way that required the executioner to bloody their hands, carried a kind of spiritual pollution, a miasma that could contaminate the entire community. But to give someone a cup and have them drink it themselves, that was different. The condemned participated in their own execution. The state remained, in a technical sense, unstained by violence. This legal fiction allowed Athens to maintain its self-image as a civilized polis while still eliminating those it deemed dangerous or criminal. Phocion learned this in 318 BC. He was an Athenian general and statesman of the highest reputation, known for his honesty and his austere lifestyle. He served as strategos, military commander, 45 times, more than any other Athenian. He opposed Alexander the Great's dominance over Athens, but when the Macedonians prevailed, he tried to negotiate the best terms possible for his city. This pragmatism was seen as treason by his political opponents. After Alexander's death, when Athens briefly tried to reassert its independence, Phocion was accused of betraying the city to Macedonia. He was 85 years old when he was brought to trial. The trial was a farce. Phocion was not allowed to speak in his own defense. When he tried, the crowd shouted him down. He was convicted by acclamation and sentenced to death by hemlock. According to Plutarch, who wrote Phocion's biography centuries later, the old general maintained his dignity to the end. Friends and family were allowed to visit him in prison, and they wept openly. Phocion comforted them, noting that at least he would die by hemlock, the same method that had killed Socrates, rather than by violence. When the time came, hemlock was prepared. Phocion drank, but there was a problem. The poison had been measured incorrectly, or perhaps Phocion's body, worn down by age, required a larger dose. The first cup was insufficient. The paralysis began, but did not complete. The executioner refused to prepare more hemlock unless he was paid additional money. 12 drachmas, he specified. Phocion's friends scrambled to gather the coins while the old man sat, in partial paralysis, waiting. Finally, the money was found. More poison was prepared. Phocion drank a second time. This time it was enough. He died. Even in death, Athens continued to punish Phocion. His body was not allowed burial within Athenian territory. It had to be carried across the border in a megara to be cremated. His family's property was confiscated. Years later, Athens would regret its treatment of Phocion and erect a statue in his honor. But by then, of course, he was long dead, another victim of Hemlock, another casualty of political fear and mob justice. Theophrastus, one of the 30 tyrants who briefly ruled Athens after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War, also died by Hemlock. His case was different because he was killed not by democratic Athens, but by his fellow oligarchs. Theophrastus had initially been part of the junta that seized power in 404 BC with Spartan backing. But he grew uncomfortable with the violence of the regime, particularly the actions of Critias, the most brutal of the 30. Theophrastus argued for moderation, suggesting that not all democratic leaders needed to be executed, that some political opponents could be exiled rather than killed. Critias saw this as weakness, as betrayal. In the meeting room where the 30 convened, he accused Theophrastus of treason against the oligarchy. Before Theophrastus could mount a defense, Critias had his name struck from the list of citizens, rendering him legally vulnerable. Armed men seized Theophrastus and dragged him toward the prison. Theophrastus, knowing what awaited him, made one last gesture of defiance. As he drank the hemlock, he flung the last drops from the cup, as if he were making a toast. "This is for the noble Critias," he said, or words to that effect. Within months, the 30 would be overthrown. Critias would die fighting the democratic forces that retook Athens, and Theophrastus would be remembered, if not as a hero, then at least as someone who tried to restrain the worst excesses of tyranny. These stories, and others like them, established Hemlock as a political weapon. It was the tool by which Athens and other Greek city-states eliminated those who challenged the established order. It was cleaner than the sword, more dignified than the noose, but just as final. Beyond Athens, the use of hemlock spread throughout the Greek world. Other polis adopted similar practices, though records are scarce. The plant was abundant, growing wild in many regions of Greece and the wider Mediterranean. Any city-state that wished to execute citizens could easily obtain it. The Romans, when they absorbed Greek culture, acknowledged hemlock's reputation but rarely used it themselves. Roman execution methods tended to be more brutal and more public. Crucifixion for slaves and non-citizens, beheading for citizens, throwing criminals from the Tarpeian Rock, being torn apart by animals in the arena. But Romans knew about hemlock. They had read Plato. They understood its symbolism, and occasionally they used it, particularly in cases of forced suicide, where a condemned person of high status was given the option to end their own life rather than face public execution. The philosopher Seneca, tutor to the Emperor Nero, was one such case. In 65 AD, Nero accused Seneca of involvement in a plot to assassinate him. The evidence was flimsy at best, but Nero wanted Seneca dead. Rather than execute his former teacher publicly, Nero sent soldiers with orders that Seneca should commit suicide. Seneca, 70 years old and suffering from poor health, opened his veins as the Roman nobility often did when taking their own lives. But the blood flowed too slowly. His aged body could not bleed out efficiently. So he asked for poison, specifically requesting hemlock, perhaps thinking of Socrates, his philosophical predecessor. But hemlock in Rome was not the same as hemlock in Athens. The plant was less common in Italy, and the preparation may have been different. Or perhaps Seneca's body, already weakened by blood loss, simply could not absorb the poison effectively. Whatever the reason, the hemlock failed to kill him quickly. Finally, he was placed in a hot bath to speed up the blood loss. He died slowly, painfully, not the philosophical death of Socrates, but the messy, prolonged death of a man whose emperor wanted him to suffer. The contrast between Socrates' death and Seneca's death illuminates the change in hemlock's reputation. In Athens, hemlock was a tool of the state, administered professionally, almost clinically. By the time of the Roman Empire, it had become associated with forced suicide, with political assassination, with the dark side of power. Greek mythology, always eager to incorporate elements of real life into its stories, gave Hemlock a divine pedigree. The goddess Hecate, who ruled over magic, crossroads, and the night, was associated with poisonous plants. Her daughters, Circe and Medea, both famous sorceresses who used plant-based potions to transform and destroy their enemies, were said to be particularly skilled with hemlock. In the myth of Medea, the scorned wife who murders her own children to punish her unfaithful husband Jason, hemlock features in several versions of the tale. Though the exact poisons Medea used vary in different tellings, hemlock is frequently mentioned as one of her tools. She knew its properties. She knew how to prepare it to kill quickly or slowly, to cause paralysis or pain. This mythological connection deepened hemlock's reputation. It was not just a poison but a magical poison, a plant touched by dark divinity, a tool of vengeance wielded by women who had been wronged. The symbolism extended to funerary practices. In some parts of ancient Greece, hemlock flowers were placed on graves, a recognition of the plant's association with death and the underworld. To decorate a tomb with hemlock was to acknowledge that the boundary between life and death was thin, that the realms of Hecate and Hades were always close at hand. Medical writers of the classical period approached hemlock with caution and respect. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, mentions it in his writings but recommends it rarely and in extremely small doses. He understood that the line between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose was razor-thin. Dioscorides, the first-century Greek physician whose pharmacological text of Materia Medica would influence medicine for 15 centuries, documented hemlock's properties in detail. He described its appearance, its habitat, its effects when consumed. He noted that it could be used externally as a cooling agent for inflammations and infections, but he warned strongly against internal use except in the most desperate circumstances. The problem, as ancient physicians understood even without modern chemistry, was that hemlock's potency varied wildly depending on where it grew, when it was harvested, and how it was prepared. A dose that produced mild sedation in one patient might cause respiratory failure in another. There was no reliable way to standardize the medicine. This unpredictability made hemlock dangerous even in the hands of skilled physicians. Stories circulated of healers who accidentally kill their patients with hemlock-based remedies. The plant's reputation for causing death was well-earned, based not just on its use in executions, but on countless medical mishaps throughout the ancient world. Yet the temptation to use such a powerful substance persisted. Hemlock's ability to reduce pain, to quiet muscle spasms, to bring on sleep, these were valuable properties in an age where effective pain relief was rare. And so physicians continued to experiment, to try to find the dosage that would heal rather than kill. Most of the time, they failed. By the end of the classical period, as the Roman Empire fragmented and the Dark Ages approached, hemlock's primary reputation was not as medicine, but as poison. It was the plant that killed Socrates, the plant used by states to eliminate their enemies, the plant sacred to Hecate and her terrible daughters. It was death in botanical form, growing wild in ditches and fields, waiting for the next hand to reach down and harvest it, the next cup to be filled, the next life to be ended. The ancient world knew hemlock well, and it feared it appropriately. Medieval shadows. When the Roman Empire fell, much of classical learning fell with it. The great libraries were burned or abandoned. The schools of philosophy closed. The infrastructure that had supported scholarship and science crumbled into ruin. But knowledge, like hemlock itself, is resilient. It survives in the cracks and margins, passed down through generations not in official texts, but in whispered warnings and practical necessity. Medieval Europe inherited a fragmented understanding of hemlock. The plant still grew wild, as it always had, in disturbed soils and along roadsides. Peasants encountered it regularly, and regularly, they made the same fatal mistakes their ancestors had made, confusing hemlock's white root for wild parsnip, its leaves for parsley, its flowers for any number of harmless umbellifers. But some knowledge survived. The medieval period was not as dark as its name suggests. at least not when it came to practical medicine. While the grand theories of ancient physicians might have been lost or garbled in translation, people still got sick, still suffered injuries, still needed relief from pain. And so herbalism, the knowledge of which plants could heal and which could kill, remained a vital, living tradition. This knowledge was held primarily by women. In an era when formal medical training was the exclusive province of the church and limited to men, women were the primary caregivers in most communities. They tended gardens. They gathered wild plants. They prepared remedies for their families and neighbors. They were the midwives who attended births, the healers who treated common ailments, the only medical practitioners most people would ever encounter. And they knew about hemlock, not from reading Dioscorides or Plato, which they could not do. Most were illiterate, but from experience, from the accumulated wisdom passed mother to daughter, from the folk tradition that preserved practical knowledge even when formal learning disappeared. They knew to stay away from the plant with purple spotted stems. They knew that the root that looked like a parsnip was deadly. They knew that even touching the plant could sometimes cause a rash, though this was less common than with some of its cousins like giant hogweed. But they also knew that in very, very small doses, hemlock had properties that could be useful. The medieval medical text known as the Lacnunga, an Anglo-Saxon collection of remedies compiled around the year 1000, mentions hemlock in a recipe for treating the bite of mad dog, rabies, one of the most feared diseases of the period. The remedy combined hemlock with betony and fennel seed, mixed with wine, and administered to the victim. Whether this actually worked is highly doubtful. Rabies is caused by a virus, and once symptoms appear, death is virtually certain even with modern medical care. A medieval herbal concoction, even one containing hemlock, would have been useless. But the recipe's existence tells us that hemlock was still being used medicinally, however ineffectively, during the early medieval period. It also tells us that medieval healers understood hemlock needed to be combined with other substances, diluted or balanced by other herbs, to reduce its toxicity. The fennel and betony might have had mild medicinal properties of their own, but more importantly, they would have diluted the concentration of hemlock alkaloids, making the dose less likely to kill the patient before the rabies did. This approach, mixing dangerous plants with safer herbs to reduce their potency, was common throughout medieval herbalism. It was a practical acknowledgement that the line between medicine and poison was not absolute, but rather a matter of dosage. The famous medieval polymath Hildegard of Bingen, a German Benedictine abbess who lived in the 12th century, wrote extensively about medicinal plants in her work Physica. She was one of the most learned people of her age, knowledgeable in medicine, music, theology, and natural philosophy. Hildegard's instructions regarding hemlock were cautious. She acknowledged its toxicity, but suggested that external applications of roasted hemlock root could relieve pain in hands and feet, particularly for conditions like gout. The roasting, she believed, reduced the plant's poisonous properties, making it safe to apply to the skin. Modern pharmacology suggests she was partly right. Heat does break down some of the volatile alkaloids in hemlock, reducing but not eliminating its toxicity. An external application of roasted root would have been far less dangerous than consuming fresh leaves. Whether it actually helped with gout is another question entirely. The important point is that Hildegard, for all her learning and caution, was still willing to use hemlock. The plant's reputation for danger had not eliminated it from the medieval pharmacopoeia. It remained a tool, dangerous but potentially useful, in the hands of someone who understood its properties. Not all uses of hemlock in medieval Europe were medicinal. The plant also features in a darker tradition, one that would explode in a horrific violence during the witch trial era of the early modern period. Flying ointments. That's what they called them. According to both folklore and the confession records from witch trials, women accused of witchcraft reportedly prepared ointments containing various psychoactive and poisonous plants. These ointments, rubbed onto the skin or onto a staff or broom handle, were said to allow the witch to fly to Sabbaths, nocturnal gatherings where they would worship the devil, engage in orgies, and plot against Christian society. Of course, the witches were not actually flying. The ointments, if they existed at all, contained plants like hemlock, henbane, belladonna, and mandrake, all of which contain alkaloids that could be absorbed through the skin and produce powerful hallucinogenic effects. A person who applied such an ointment might indeed feel as though they were flying, might experience vivid dreams, or waking visions of travel and transformation. But this knowledge comes primarily from two sources: folklore and confessions extracted under torture. We must be extremely cautious about accepting these accounts as historical fact. The great witch hunts of early modern Europe, which peaked between 1450 and 1750, resulted in the execution of somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people, most of them women. The accusations were baseless. The confessions were coerced. The trials were travesties of justice motivated by misogyny, religious paranoia, and social scapegoating. Did any of the accused actually prepare and use flying ointments? Almost certainly not. The entire concept seems to have been an invention of the inquisitors, based on classical literature about witches like Medea and Circe, projected onto real women who had the misfortune to be old, poor, unmarried, or simply unpopular in their communities. But the fact that hemlock featured in these recipes, whether real or imagined, tells us something important about its reputation. By the late medieval period, hemlock had become firmly associated not just with execution or medicine, but with witchcraft, with dark magic, with women who existed outside of social norms. This association was reinforced by religious authorities. Nicholas Culpeper, the 17th century English herbalist and physician, wrote in his Complete Herbal that hemlock was under the dominion of Saturn, the planet associated in medieval astrology with cold, darkness, and death. Culpeper recommended against internal use of hemlock, but suggested that the leaves, applied externally, could reduce swelling and inflammation. His warning, however, was stark. Hemlock is very dangerous, he wrote, and should only be used by those with expert knowledge. Even then, I would not advise the use of it. This ambivalence captures the medieval attitude toward hemlock. It was recognized as having potential medicinal value. It was known to relieve pain and reduce inflammation. But its dangers were so great, its potency so unpredictable, that even experienced herbalists hesitated to employ it. The monasteries, which preserved much medical knowledge during the medieval period, treated hemlock with particular caution. Monks cultivated medicinal herb gardens, growing plants needed for treating the sick. But hemlock, along with other highly poisonous plants, was rarely, if ever, deliberately grown within monastery walls. The risk of accidental poisoning, of confusion between hemlock and safe herbs, was too great. When monks did prepare hemlock-based remedies, they did so according to written recipes preserved from classical sources, following procedures designed to minimize risk. The emphasis was always on external application rather than internal use. Ointments and poultices rather than drafts and teas. Even so, accidents happened. Medical texts from the medieval period occasionally mention cases of poisoning from hemlock-based treatments. A patient given a remedy for one ailment would develop the characteristic symptoms of hemlock toxicity: numbness, paralysis, respiratory distress. Sometimes they survived. Often they did not. These cases reinforced hemlock's reputation as a plant that required the utmost respect and caution. It was not something to be casually gathered and used. It was a plant that could kill with the slightest mistake in identification or dosage. By the end of the medieval period, hemlock occupied a complex place in European consciousness. It was simultaneously a medicine and a poison, a tool of healers and a weapon of witches, a plant mentioned in respected herbals, and a plant associated with the darkest aspects of human nature. It was, in essence, the plant that should not be touched, but sometimes was, when no other option remained, by people desperate enough or foolish enough or brave enough to take the risk. Most of them regretted it. The Age of Inquiry. The Renaissance brought a new approach to understanding the natural world. Instead of relying solely on ancient authorities or folk wisdom, scholars began to observe, to experiment, to question. The scientific method was born, slowly, fitfully, but inexorably. Hemlock, like all medicinal plants, became a subject of renewed investigation. If the plant was poisonous, scholars wanted to understand exactly how and why. If it had medicinal properties, they wanted to know precisely what those properties were and how to harness them safely. The great herbals of the 16th and 17th centuries cataloged hemlock alongside thousands of other plants. These were not simple lists but detailed examinations, describing appearance, habitat, traditional uses, and observed effects. John Gerard's Herbal, or General History of Plants, published in London in 1597, included an extensive entry on hemlock. Gerard described the plant's appearance in detail, noting the purple spots on the stem, the finely divided leaves, the white flowers. He recounted its reputation from classical sources, mentioning Socrates and other famous victims. But Gerard also included more practical information. He described cases of people who had eaten hemlock by mistake, confusing it with wild carrot or celery. He noted the symptoms: vertigo, darkness of vision, trembling, convulsions. He recommended immediate vomiting, followed by strong drink and warmth to counteract the plant's cold nature. These recommendations reflect the medical theory of the time, the belief that diseases were caused by imbalances in bodily humors and that plants had innate qualities of hot, cold, wet, or dry that could be used to restore balance. Modern medicine has abandoned these concepts, but the practical advice to induce vomiting after poisoning remains sound. Nicholas Culpeper, writing in the mid-17th century, was blunter about hemlock's dangers. In his Complete Herbal, he warned that hemlock was very dangerous to be taken inwardly. He acknowledged its traditional use as a medicine, but recommended it only for external application as a cooling agent for inflammations and swellings. Culpeper's herbal was written for a general audience, not just for physicians. It was meant to democratize medical knowledge, to give ordinary people the information they needed to treat common ailments without always needing to pay a doctor. His strong warnings about hemlock reflect his understanding that his readers might not have the expertise to use such a dangerous plant safely. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the beginning of what we would recognize as clinical trials, careful observations of how medicines affected patients. Physicians began to publish case studies, documenting their experiences with various treatments. One of the most important early investigators of hemlock was Anton von Storch, an Austrian physician who served as personal doctor to the Empress Maria Theresa in the mid-18th century. Von Storch was interested in the medical potential of poisonous plants, believing that substances powerful enough to kill might also be powerful enough to heal if used in the right doses. He published his findings in 1760 in a work titled Libellus, Quo Demonstrator, Secutum non solum usu interno tudicime exhibere, which translates roughly as a treatise demonstrating that hemlock can be administered internally with complete safety. The title reflects the optimism of the age, the belief that scientific investigation could tame even the deadliest substances. Von Storch's methodology was, by modern standards, both brave and foolhardy. He began by testing hemlock preparations on animals, observing their effects on dogs and cats. When he was satisfied that he understood the dosage needed to produce effects without causing death, he moved to human trials. The first human subject was himself. Von Storch prepared a hemlock extract according to a precise recipe, using dried leaves that he pulverized and mixed with water to form a paste. He started with an extremely small dose, approximately 1 grain, roughly 65 milligrams. Nothing happened. He gradually increased the dose over subsequent days, carefully noting any effects. At larger doses, he experienced slight dizziness, a feeling of heaviness in the limbs, and mild nausea. But he did not experience the progressive paralysis described in accounts of hemlock poisoning. Why not? Modern analysis suggests several possibilities. First, von Storch used dried leaves, and hemlock loses much of its potency when dried. The volatile alkaloids evaporate over time. Second, his extraction method may not have been particularly efficient at isolating the conian. Third, he was extremely cautious about dosage, taking far less than would be needed to cause serious poisoning. Satisfied that he had found a safe therapeutic dose, von Storch began prescribing hemlock extract to patients suffering from various ailments. He treated 20 cases in total, documenting each one. His patients suffered from conditions ranging from cancerous tumors to scrofula, a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes. The results were mixed at best. Some patients reported subjective improvement in their symptoms. Others showed no response whatsoever. Several experienced significant side effects, including vertigo, weakness, and digestive problems. Von Storch concluded that hemlock had potential as a medicine for reducing inflammation and relieving pain in certain conditions. He recommended it particularly for chronic diseases where other treatments had failed and the patient had little to lose by trying something new. His work was published and widely read throughout Europe. It sparked renewed interest in hemlock as a medicine. For a few decades, hemlock preparations appeared in pharmacies across the continent. Physicians prescribed it, cautiously, for a range of ailments. But the therapeutic window remained extremely narrow. A dose large enough to produce noticeable medical effects was uncomfortably close to a dose that could cause serious poisoning. Patients who took hemlock regularly often experienced cumulative toxicity, developing the symptoms of chronic poisoning: weakness, tremors, confusion. In England, physician John Harley conducted his own experiments with hemlock in the mid-19th century. Harley was a botanist and physician particularly interested in the medical properties of native British plants. Like von Storch, he believed in self-experimentation as a way to understand drug effects. In 1869, Harley published The Old Vegetable Neurotics, a detailed study of hemlock and several related poisonous plants. His account of dosing himself with hemlock extract is both scientifically valuable and somewhat terrifying. Harley prepared what he called succus conii, fresh hemlock juice extracted from the plant. He started with a small dose and carefully observed the effects. Within an hour and a quarter, he experienced distinct weakness in his legs. He described a peculiar sensation of giddiness combined with diminished motor power. His body felt heavy, as though half asleep, but his mind remained completely clear and active. The symptoms continued to intensify for about 15 more minutes before reaching a plateau. At their peak, Harley was cold, pale, and tottering. He could barely stand. If he had taken a larger dose, he believed he would have progressed to complete paralysis and respiratory failure. But as it was, the effects gradually wore off over several hours. By evening, he was back to normal, though somewhat shaken by the experience. Harley's description is remarkably similar to Plato's account of Socrates' death, minus the fatal conclusion. The progressive paralysis, the retention of consciousness, the coldness and weakness. These were clearly the authentic symptoms of hemlock poisoning. His published work confirmed what classical sources had described and demonstrated that poison hemlock, Conia maculatum, was indeed the plant that had killed Socrates. This settled a long-standing debate, as some scholars had suggested that the hemlock of ancient Greece must have been a different species with different effects. By the late 19th century, hemlock had been included in official pharmacopoeias, the authoritative lists of approved medicines used by physicians and pharmacists. The London Pharmacopoeia listed it. So did the Edinburgh Pharmacopoeia. It appeared in the British Pharmaceutical Codex as late as 1934. But its inclusion came with extensive warnings and restrictions. Hemlock was to be used only as a last resort, only by experienced physicians, only in carefully measured doses. It was prescribed primarily for its antispasmodic effects, to reduce muscle spasms in conditions like tetanus or epilepsy. Even so, its use declined steadily throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Safer alternatives were being discovered. Morphine, isolated from opium, provided more reliable pain relief. Chloroform and ether revolutionized anesthesia. Aspirin and other synthetic drugs offered anti-inflammatory effects without the life-threatening side effects of hemlock. By the mid-20th century, hemlock had essentially disappeared from legitimate medical practice in the Western world. The last references to its use in official pharmacopoeias were removed. Medical schools stopped teaching about it, except in the context of toxicology, as an example of a dangerous plant that doctors should help patients avoid. The age of hemlock as medicine was over. But the age of hemlock as a poison, as a historical curiosity, as a symbol, had just begun. The poison in culture. While hemlock was gradually disappearing from medical practice, it was flourishing in another realm entirely, the human imagination. The plant that killed Socrates had become one of the most famous plants in Western culture, recognized even by people who knew nothing about botany. It appeared in literature, in art, in the collective consciousness as a symbol of fate, of death, of the tragic price of wisdom. Perhaps no writer used hemlock more memorably than William Shakespeare. In his plays, hemlock appears again and again, always in contexts of darkness, of evil, of unnatural death. In Macbeth, the three witches include hemlock in their infamous cauldron, brewing a charm of powerful trouble. Root of hemlock digged, I dark. One of the weird sisters chants, adding the poison to a mixture that includes everything from newt's eyes to wolf's teeth. The specification that the hemlock should be dug in the dark was significant. Medieval belief held that poisonous plants harvested in darkness, without the purifying light of the moon or sun, took on additional evil powers. In King Lear, the Mad King wears a crown of weeds that includes hemlock, a symbol of his mental deterioration and his fall from power. The crown that should have been gold and authority is now vegetation and poison, reflecting Lear's transformation from ruler to madman, from father to fool. In Henry V, as the Duke of Burgundy describes the devastation of France during war, he mentions fields and vineyards overgrown with hemlock and other noxious weeds. The hemlock here represents the breakdown of civilization, the return to chaos when human cultivation is abandoned. Shakespeare never uses hemlock for plot, as he does with other poisons. Hamlet's father is not killed by hemlock, but by some mysterious substance called hebenon, possibly henbane or yew. Romeo and Juliet die from unnamed poisons. But hemlock appears as atmosphere, as symbolism, as a way of evoking death and darkness. Shakespeare's audience would have recognized the references immediately. Hemlock was part of their cultural vocabulary, understood without explanation. To say a field was overgrown with hemlock was to say it had been cursed, abandoned, given over to death. The plant also appears in the work of John Keats, one of the English Romantic poets. The opening lines of his famous Ode to a Nightingale reference hemlock explicitly. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains slash my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk. Keats is describing a state of melancholy, of painful awareness mixed with a desire for oblivion. The comparison to hemlock is both apt and, from a medical standpoint, slightly inaccurate. Keats, who trained as an apothecary and should have known better, seems to treat hemlock as a soporific, something that brings drowsy numbness. In reality, hemlock causes paralysis while consciousness often remains sharp. But this is poetry, not pharmacology. Keats is using hemlock symbolically, evoking the famous death of Socrates, suggesting a state between life and death, consciousness and unconsciousness, painful awareness and blessed numbness. The fact that Keats's pharmacology is slightly off only demonstrates how much hemlock had moved from medical reality into cultural symbol. It no longer mattered exactly what hemlock did to the body. What mattered was what it meant to the mind. Death, wisdom, tragedy, the price of asking difficult questions. Artists also found hemlock compelling. The death of Socrates became one of the most painted scenes from classical antiquity. Dozens of artists across centuries created their versions, from Renaissance frescoes to neoclassical oils. The most famous is probably Jacques-Louis David's 1787 painting The Death of Socrates. David, a French neoclassical artist, depicted Socrates at the moment of taking the poison. The philosopher sits upright on his bed, one hand raised in a teaching gesture, the other reaching for the cup of hemlock offered by a grief-stricken jailer. Around him, his students react with various degrees of horror and sorrow. Only Socrates himself appears calm, even triumphant. The painting is not historically accurate. Plato appears as an old man at the foot of the bed, though he was only 28 when Socrates died and was reportedly not present at the execution. Xanthippe, Socrates' wife, is shown ascending stairs in the background, though according to Plato's account, she had been sent home hours earlier. The students are arranged in classical poses that sacrifice realism for dramatic effect. But historical accuracy was not David's goal. He was creating an icon, a visual representation of the philosopher's courage in the face of death. The painting became hugely influential, reproduced in engravings that spread across Europe and America. For many people, this image defined how they imagined Socrates' death. And at the center of the image, compositionally and symbolically, is the cup containing hemlock, the instrument of execution that paradoxically made Socrates immortal. The Victorians, with their complex attitudes toward death and their language of flowers, incorporated hemlock into their symbolic vocabulary. In the Victorian language of flowers, where every plant carried a specific meaning, hemlock meant, "You will be the death of me." It was a dramatic statement, suggesting that someone's love or rejection would be fatal, that emotional pain was equivalent to poison. Victorian lovers could send coded messages through carefully chosen bouquets, and including hemlock, however morbid it might seem to modern sensibilities, conveyed a very specific sentiment. Of course, one would never actually include real hemlock in a bouquet. The plant was too dangerous, too easily confused with other white-flowered umbellifers. The meaning existed in books and in theory, not in actual practice. But the fact that Victorians felt the need to assign hemlock a meaning in their floral code demonstrates its place in cultural consciousness. It was famous enough, recognizable enough, that people knew what it was and what it represented. In folklore and superstition, hemlock accumulated layers of meaning. It was said to grow on ground where blood had been spilled, which had some basis in fact since hemlock thrives in disturbed soils. It was associated with graveyards and execution sites. Children were warned away from it with stories of tragic accidents, of young people who ate hemlock thinking it was something else and died in agony. Some of these warnings were based on real incidents. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, cases of accidental hemlock poisoning continued to occur. People foraging for wild food confused hemlock with edible plants. Children playing in fields put hemlock seeds in their mouths. Farm animals grazing in pastures contaminated with hemlock died in numbers that threatened agricultural economies. Each tragedy reinforced hemlock's reputation. Each death became a cautionary tale, passed down through families and communities. Stay away from the plant with purple spots on the stem. Don't eat anything that smells like that. If you're not absolutely certain it's safe, don't touch it. By the 20th century, hemlock existed in culture primarily as a historical reference and a contemporary danger. People knew about it because of Socrates. They feared it because of its continuing ability to kill the unwary. The plant itself remained abundant, spreading beyond its native range to become an invasive species in many parts of the world. North America, Australia, New Zealand all saw hemlock populations explode as European settlers inadvertently introduced the plant. In some regions, it became so common that it threatened agricultural land and natural ecosystems. Government agencies began issuing warnings about hemlock. Educational materials showed how to identify the plant. Herbicide programs tried to control its spread. Farmers learned to watch for it in their fields and pastures and to destroy it before it could seed. But despite these efforts, hemlock persisted. It was too good at reproducing, too adaptable to various environments, too well established to be easily eliminated. And so the duality continued. Hemlock as history, as the plant that killed Socrates, as a symbol of wisdom's price, and hemlock as present danger, as the plant growing by the roadside, as the thing that looked edible but was death. Culture preserved the memory of what hemlock meant. But the plant itself ensured that the danger was never merely historical, never safely in the past. Every year, somewhere in the world, someone would reach out and touch hemlock, eat it, brew it into tea, or feed it to livestock. And every year, hemlock would do what it has always done, what it has been doing for thousands of years. It would kill. The chemical truth. The 19th century brought a revolution in chemistry and pharmacology. Scientists were no longer content to simply observe that hemlock was poisonous. They want to know why. What exactly in the plant caused its lethal effects? Could that substance be isolated, purified, studied? The answer would come in the 1820s through the work of several chemists working independently across Europe. The race was on to identify and isolate the active principle of hemlock, to transform folk knowledge and classical learning into modern science. The term alkaloid was still relatively new. It referred to a class of nitrogen-containing compounds found in plants that had powerful physiological effects. Morphine had been isolated from opium in 1804. Quinine had been extracted from cinchona bark in 1820. The scientific world was learning that plant medicines and plant poisons were not mysterious vital forces, but chemical compounds that could be studied and understood. In 1826, a German chemist named Friedrich Gautier claimed to have isolated the active principle of hemlock. He called it coniine, from the Greek name for the plant. But his isolation was crude, his sample impure. He had identified something from hemlock, but he hadn't definitively isolated the main toxin. The breakthrough came in 1831, when another German chemist named Geiger refined the process. He succeeded in extracting a colorless, oily liquid from hemlock that had the characteristic smell and properties of the poison. This was coniine in a much purer form. Finally, in 1860, Albert Niemann, working at the University of Göttingen under the supervision of Friedrich Wöhler, achieved a pure crystalline isolation of coniine. He determined its chemical formula, C8H17N. It was an alkaloid, as expected, containing nitrogen along with carbon and hydrogen. Coniine had the distinction of being the first alkaloid to have its complete chemical structure determined. In 1881, the German chemist Hofmann elucidated the precise arrangement of atoms in the molecule. It was a piperidine alkaloid, based on a six-membered ring containing 5 carbon atoms and 1 nitrogen atom, with a propyl side chain. But the most remarkable achievement came in 1886 when Albert Ladenburg successfully synthesized coniine in the laboratory. This was the first time any alkaloid had been synthesized from simpler chemical compounds rather than extracted from a plant. It was a landmark moment in the history of organic chemistry, proving that these complex natural products were not fundamentally different from other chemical compounds. They could be understood, predicted, and created by human hands. The synthesis of coniine opened new possibilities. Chemists could now create variations on the coniine molecule, testing how structural changes affected toxicity and biological activity. They could produce pure, standardized samples for medical research. They could, in theory, create a version of coniine that retained its therapeutic properties while reducing its dangers. In practice, this never quite worked. Every variation on coniine structure either reduced its potency to uselessness or retained enough toxicity to remain dangerous. The compound's therapeutic window remained frustratingly narrow. Modern chemistry has revealed that coniine exists as 2 mirror image forms called enantiomers, designated as coniine and arconiine. These molecules have the same chemical formula, but different three-dimensional structures, like a person's left and right hands. In nature, hemlock produces a mixture of both forms. The 2 enantiomers have different levels of toxicity. Arconiine is about twice as toxic as S-coniine. This helps explain some of the variability in hemlock poisoning cases. Depending on which enantiomer predominates in a particular plant and how the preparation is made, the same amount of plant material might produce very different effects. The mechanism of coniine's toxicity was gradually revealed through the 20th century. The alkaloid works as an antagonist of nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. These receptors are found at neuromuscular junctions, where nerve cells communicate with muscle cells, and in the autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary functions like heart rate and breathing. Conian molecules fit into these receptors like a key in a lock, but they're the wrong key. They occupy the receptor site without properly activating it, blocking the natural neurotransmitter acetylcholine from doing its job. This disrupts the communication between nerves and muscles. The result is a progressive loss of motor function. Muscles can no longer receive the signals telling them to contract. Voluntary movement becomes impossible. Eventually, the muscles responsible for breathing, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, fail to function. Death occurs from respiratory arrest. What makes Conian particularly insidious is that it crosses the blood-brain barrier slowly or not at all on moderate doses. This means that consciousness is often preserved even as the body becomes completely paralyzed. The victim is aware, can think clearly, can understand what is happening, but cannot move or speak or cry out for help. In high doses, Conian does affect the central nervous system, causing confusion, loss of consciousness, and seizures. But in the doses typically encountered in cases of poisoning, both accidental and deliberate, the mind remains lucid while the body shuts down. Modern toxicology has also revealed why there is no antidote to Conian poisoning. The alkaloid binds tightly to the nicotinic receptors and is not easily displaced by other chemicals. There is no substance that can competitively or non-competitively reverse Conian's effects at those receptor sites. The only treatment is supportive care. Maintain the airway. Provide mechanical ventilation if the patient cannot breathe on their own. Monitor heart function and blood pressure. Treat complications like rhabdomyolysis, the breakdown of muscle tissue that can lead to kidney failure. And wait. If the dose was not immediately lethal, if the patient can be kept alive through the critical period, the body will eventually metabolize and excrete the Conian. The alkaloid does not persist indefinitely. Within 48 to 72 hours, assuming the patient survives that long, normal function should return. But those 48 to 72 hours can be an eternity. Lying in a hospital bed, conscious but paralyzed, dependent on machines to breathe, not knowing if recovery is possible. It is, in its way, a modern version of the death of Socrates, except that sometimes, with medical intervention, the ending is different. Sometimes the victim survives. Laboratory studies have also examined the other alkaloids found in hemlock. Gamma-coniciine, N-methylconiine, conhydrine, and pseudoconhydrin all have similar but slightly different effects. Some are more potent than Conian. Others are less so, but still dangerous. The concentration of these alkaloids in the plant varies depending on many factors: the age of the plant, the season, the part of the plant, the growing conditions. Young growth in spring has different alkaloid profiles than mature plants in fall. Seeds contain the highest concentrations. Roots are also highly toxic. Leaves and stems have lower but still dangerous levels. This variability means that hemlock poisoning can present differently in different cases. A person who consumes primarily seeds might experience more violent symptoms than someone who consumes leaves. A child who eats a root might die within an hour, while an adult who consumes a similar amount of leaves might have several hours of symptoms before respiratory failure occurs. There is no safe way to consume hemlock. Even tiny amounts can cause symptoms. Even external contact with the plant sap can rarely cause dermatitis in sensitive individuals, though this is much less common than with some other toxic plants in the same family. The scientific investigation of hemlock has given us precise knowledge of what the plant contains, how it works, why it kills. We understand the chemistry, the pharmacology, the toxicology at a level that ancient Greeks or medieval herbalists could never have imagined. But this knowledge has not made hemlock less dangerous. If anything, it has simply given us a clearer picture of exactly how perilous the plant is, how narrow the margin between exposure and death, how helpless medicine is to reverse its effects once the poison has done its work. Science has illuminated hemlock's secrets, but it has not disarmed its power. The modern menace. In the 21st century, One might think hemlock would be a historical curiosity, a plant from ancient Athens with no relevance to modern life. But that assumption would be dangerously wrong. Hemlock is not a relic. It is a contemporary threat, arguably more dangerous now than ever before because it is so widespread, so accessible, and so easily mistaken for harmless plants. In North America, poison hemlock has become an invasive species. Introduced in the 1800s, possibly as an ornamental garden plant, because of its attractive white flowers, it has spread throughout the United States and southern Canada. It grows in all 50 states, thriving particularly in areas with moderate climates and adequate moisture. The plant colonizes disturbed habitats with aggressive efficiency. Roadsides, ditches, field margins, stream banks, vacant lots, construction sites. Anywhere soil has been disturbed, hemlock can establish itself. A single plant produces tens of thousands of seeds, and those seeds remain viable in soil for up to 6 years. This reproductive capacity, combined with the lack of natural predators or diseases that affect hemlock in North America, has allowed the plant to spread rapidly. In some regions, it forms dense stands that exclude native vegetation and create ecological dead zones. For agriculture, hemlock poses a serious threat. Livestock deaths from hemlock poisoning occur regularly. Cattle, horses, sheep, and goats can all be poisoned if they consume the plant. Typically, this happens when hemlock has grown in hay fields and been cut and baled with the forage. Animals that would normally avoid the plant when grazing will eat it when it's dried and mixed with hay. The symptoms in livestock mirror those in humans. Initial nervousness and excessive salivation, followed by incoordination, muscle tremors, and progressive paralysis leading to respiratory failure and death. There is no effective treatment. Affected animals either recover on their own if the dose was small or die within hours if the dose was lethal. Pregnant animals that consume sublethal amounts of hemlock face another danger. The alkaloids can cause severe birth defects in developing fetuses, leading to offspring with skeletal deformities, particularly cleft palate and crooked limbs. These effects have been well documented in cattle and pigs. But livestock are not the only modern victims. Humans continue to be poisoned by hemlock, usually accidentally, occasionally intentionally. One pattern involves foragers, people gathering wild plants for food. The modern interest in foraging, in eating wild edibles, in connecting with nature through food, has exposed a new generation to the dangers that have existed for millennia. Hemlock's resemblance to edible plants in the carrot family remains a deadly trap. The roots are most commonly confused with wild parsnips or wild carrots. They are white, fleshy, have a pleasant smell when first dug, and look remarkably similar to the cultivated vegetables they resemble. Only the purple spots on the stem above, and a more pungent smell when crushed, distinguish hemlock from its edible cousins. Children have died from sucking on hollow hemlock stems used as play whistles. Adults have died from adding hemlock leaves to salads, thinking they were harvesting parsley or cilantro. Entire families have been sickened from eating soups or stews flavored with foraged, wild carrot roots that were actually hemlock. In 2011, a case from Hong Kong was reported in medical literature. A 59-year-old man collected what he believed were edible plants from a hillside and cooked them with pork for dinner. Within 2 hours, he developed severe symptoms: numbness in his extremities, difficulty walking, muscle weakness. His family rushed him to the hospital. By the time he arrived, he was in respiratory failure. He required mechanical ventilation for 48 hours. Fortunately, the dose was not quite lethal. He survived, making a full recovery over the next several days. Laboratory analysis of the plants he had collected confirmed they were poison hemlock. In Turkey, a case series from 2021 described 3 shepherds who mistakenly consumed hemlock. All 3 were admitted to the emergency department with similar symptoms: burning sensation in the mouth, excessive salivation, hand tremors, difficulty walking, confusion. One developed severe metabolic acidosis and rhabdomyolysis, requiring intensive care. All 3 eventually recovered, but their cases illustrate how easily trained outdoor workers, people who should theoretically know the local flora, can make fatal mistakes. From Australia, a 1995 report describes 3 deaths within a short period. 3 young men, separately, intentionally consumed hemlock, apparently using information they had found about plant-based methods of suicide. All 3 died despite medical intervention. The report highlighted a disturbing trend. Information about poisonous plants was becoming readily available through books and, increasingly, through the early internet, and some people were using that information not to avoid danger, but to intentionally harm themselves. Most tragic are the cases involving children. A 2016 report from Turkey describes a 6-year-old girl who ate hemlock leaves while playing near a stream. Her parents noticed her symptoms within an hour: difficulty walking, tremors, excessive salivation. They rushed her to the hospital. She was lethargic and ataxic on arrival. Her symptoms worsened initially, requiring careful monitoring and supportive care. But children, with their smaller body mass and faster metabolism, often respond differently to poisons than adults. The girl survived without the need for mechanical ventilation, recovering fully over 24 hours. She was extraordinarily lucky. The most recent trend in hemlock poisoning involves substance abuse. A 2017 case report from the United States describes a 30-year-old man who injected a homemade hemlock extract intravenously, apparently attempting to achieve some kind of high or altered state. The results were catastrophic. He suffered cardiac arrest within minutes. Emergency responders arrived to find him unconscious and not breathing. They resuscitated him and transported him to the hospital, where he remained in critical condition for days. He developed prolonged muscular weakness and encephalopathy, neurological damage affecting his cognitive function. He required a tracheostomy, a surgical opening in his neck to maintain his airway. After weeks in intensive care, he eventually recovered enough to be discharged, but with permanent neurological deficits. This case is particularly concerning because it represents a new route of exposure. Intravenous injection delivers the alkaloids directly to the bloodstream, bypassing the digestive system entirely. The onset is faster, the effects more severe, the margin for survival narrower than with oral consumption. The modern approach to managing hemlock involves both ecological control and public education. In areas where hemlock is invasive, land management agencies attempt to control its spread through several methods. Mechanical removal, pulling young plants by hand before they produce seeds, cutting mature plants before they flower. This requires consistent effort over multiple years to deplete the seed bank in the soil. Chemical control, applying herbicides like glyphosate or triclopyr to hemlock populations. Timing is critical. Applications in early spring or late fall are most effective. But chemical control must be balanced against environmental concerns about herbicide use. Biological control. Researchers are investigating potential biological control agents, insects or diseases that might specifically target hemlock without affecting related native plants. This approach is still experimental and controversial. Public education. Teaching people to identify hemlock, warning foragers about the dangers of misidentification, informing landowners about the presence of the plant on their property. The challenge is that hemlock is not just a single problem, but many problems at once. It's an invasive species threatening ecosystems. It's an agricultural pest killing livestock. It's a public health hazard poisoning humans. And it's a plant so common and so widespread that completely eliminating it from any region where it has established itself is effectively impossible. The best we can do is management. Reduce populations where possible. Warn people about the dangers. Treat victims when poisoning occurs. And accept that hemlock, like death itself, will always be with us. In some ways, the modern situation mirrors the ancient one. Athenians knew hemlock grew in their fields and forests. They knew it was dangerous. They used that danger for their own purposes. And they accepted its presence as an unavoidable fact of life. We find ourselves in a similar position. We know hemlock is out there, growing by the sides of our roads, in our parks and nature preserves, perhaps even in our own backyards. We know it can kill. We've learned from chemistry exactly how it kills. We've documented cases of death and near-death from modern encounters with the plant. And yet we cannot make it go away. The technology that allows us to identify every alkaloid in hemlock's tissues cannot prevent a child from putting a hemlock stem in their mouth. The medical knowledge that allows us to mechanically ventilate a poisoned patient cannot reverse the effects of coniine on their neuromuscular junctions. Hemlock in the 21st century is simultaneously well understood and powerfully dangerous, familiar and foreign, a historical curiosity and a contemporary threat. It is, in other words, exactly what it has always been, a plant that kills, that has killed for thousands of years, that will continue to kill for as long as it grows and humans are foolish enough or unlucky enough to encounter it. The eternal poison. We have walked a long path together, from ancient Athens to modern emergency rooms, from Socrates' final conversation to contemporary toxicology reports. And throughout this journey, one plant has been our constant companion, hemlock. What have we learned? That beauty masks danger. That knowledge does not equal safety. That some things in nature are simply, fundamentally, profoundly poisonous, and no amount of careful study or noble intention can change that fact. Hemlock is a paradox. It is a plant that served as medicine and as execution tool, as symbol of wisdom and as instrument of death. The same alkaloids that ancient physicians hoped to harness for healing killed patients as often as they helped them. The same plant that gave Socrates an exit worthy of a philosopher has killed children who didn't understand the danger they were in. The story of hemlock is, in many ways, the story of humanity's relationship with the natural world. We see something powerful, and we want to use it. We see something dangerous, and we try to understand it. We create myths and symbols around what we cannot fully control. We forget the lessons of our ancestors and rediscover them painfully through our own mistakes. In every age, hemlock has been both familiar and mysterious. The ancient Greeks knew it well enough to use it for executions, but not well enough to use it safely as medicine. Medieval herbalists preserved knowledge about the plant, but surrounded that knowledge with superstition and folklore. Renaissance scientists began to approach it systematically, but still could not fully tame its power. Modern chemists have mapped every atom and its alkaloids, but still cannot create an antidote. The plant itself remains unchanged. Conium maculatum, growing by roadsides, in fields, along stream banks, producing the same alkaloids, presenting the same dangers. White flowers and umbrella clusters, purple spotted hollow stems, finely divided leaves, a bitter, pungent smell. Generation after generation encounters this plant, and generation after generation learns, sometimes at terrible cost, that it should be left alone. There is something almost philosophical about this. Hemlock killed the philosopher, but perhaps hemlock is also a kind of philosopher, teaching harsh lessons about the limits of human control, about the indifference of nature to human intentions, about the thin line between medicine and poison, knowledge and ignorance, life and death. Socrates chose to drink the hemlock rather than betray his principles. In doing so, he demonstrated that death was not the worst thing that could happen to a person. Compromising one's integrity, betraying one's beliefs, living as a hypocrite, these were worse than death. But Socrates also demonstrated the power of ideas. He died, but his philosophy lived on, transmitted through his students to become the foundation of Western thought. Hemlock killed his body, but could not kill what he represented. The value of asking difficult questions, of challenging authority, of seeking truth even when that search leads to uncomfortable places. The modern world has learned much since Socrates' time. We understand the chemistry of poison in ways no ancient Greek could imagine. We have medical technologies that can keep poison patients alive through the critical period when their bodies fight to expel the toxins. We have communication systems that can spread warnings about dangerous plants to millions of people instantly. And yet, people still die from hemlock. They die from misidentification, from ignorance, from bad luck. They die despite all our knowledge, despite all our technology, despite all our warnings. Perhaps this is Hemlock's final lesson, that knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. We know a great deal about this plant. We can analyze its alkaloids. We can describe its mechanism of action. We can synthesize coniine in a laboratory. But we cannot make ourselves wise enough to avoid all encounters with danger. We cannot protect everyone from every possible harm. We cannot eliminate risk from the world, no matter how much we might wish to. Hemlock will continue to grow. People will continue to encounter it. Some will recognize it and leave it alone. Others will mistake it for something else and suffer the consequences. A few will deliberately seek it out, as Socrates did, though probably for less noble reasons. And the plant will continue to do what it has done for millennia: grow, flower, produce seeds, and occasionally kill. In this sense, hemlock is eternal, not immortal like the gods of ancient Greece, not unchanging like the stars, but persistent, enduring, always present. As long as there are disturbed soils and temperate climates, hemlock will thrive. As long as humans are curious or careless or desperate, some will consume it. The story of hemlock is not over. It will never be over. There will be more cases of poisoning, more tragic mistakes, more desperate attempts to use the plant as medicine or poison. There will be new research, new understanding of its chemistry and ecology. There will be new literary references, new cultural interpretations, new ways of thinking about this ancient plant. But the fundamental reality will not change. Hemlock was dangerous when Socrates drank it in 399 BC. It is dangerous today. It will be dangerous 1,000 years from now. Perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps some things should remain dangerous, should resist human efforts to fully control or understand them. Perhaps the existence of hemlock in the world reminds us that nature is not a garden we can perfectly cultivate, not a library we can completely catalog, not a problem we can definitively solve. Nature simply is, and part of what it is includes plants that kill. Socrates understood this in his own way. When he drank the hemlock, he did not curse the plant or the poison or the people who had condemned him. He accepted it as part of the world, as part of his life's conclusion, as part of the natural order of things. In that acceptance, he found a kind of freedom. Not freedom from death. That was impossible. But freedom from fear, from regret, from the desperate struggle to avoid the inevitable. He drank. He walked. He lay down. He died. And the hemlock that killed him became the hemlock we remember, the most famous poison in Western history, the plant that killed the philosopher but could not kill philosophy itself. That is hemlock's final paradox. It is powerful enough to kill the greatest minds. But it is powerless against ideas, against memory, against the human determination to learn from the past and pass that knowledge to future generations. We remember Socrates not because he was killed, but because of how he faced that death, what he said, what he represented. The hemlock is merely a detail in that story, albeit a famous one. Or perhaps that's not quite right. Perhaps the hemlock is more than a detail. Perhaps it is the mechanism by which the story became immortal, the catalyst that transformed a legal execution into a philosophical statement. Without the hemlock, Socrates would have died anyway, eventually of old age or disease. His death would have been unremarkable, unmemorable. But the hemlock gave him a death worthy of remembering, a death that his students could witness and record, a death that became part of his teaching. So perhaps we should thank the hemlock. It gave us one of the most profound moments in Western philosophy. It showed us how a wise person faces death. It transformed an old man into an eternal symbol. But we should also fear it, because for every Socrates who drinks hemlock and achieves immortality, there are thousands of forgotten victims. People who died accidentally, painfully, without witnesses, without meaning. People whose last moments were terror and confusion rather than philosophical acceptance. The hemlock does not care who drinks it or why. It has no preferences, no favorites, no sense of justice or injustice. It is simply a plant, making alkaloids, protecting itself from herbivores in the only way evolution has given it. That it killed Socrates was an accident of history, a coincidence that Athens chose this particular plant as its method of execution. If they had chosen another poison, another method, Socrates would still have died, and his philosophy would still have survived. But the story would have been different. The details would have changed. And perhaps those details matter. Perhaps the specific image of the cup, the progressive paralysis, the calm acceptance, perhaps these elements contributed to the power of the story, to its ability to move and inspire people across 21st centuries. So we return to where we began. In a cell in Athens. An old man with a cup. Friends weeping. The poison working its way through his body. Death approaching. And we understand that this moment, this story, this plant, have shaped our civilization in ways large and small. Hemlock is in our literature, our art, our collective imagination. It is a symbol we recognize, even if we have never seen the plant itself. But it is also real, growing out there, dangerous, waiting to be encountered, to be misidentified, to be consumed. Both symbol and substance, both past and present, both poison and plant. This is hemlock. This is its history. This is its nature. And this is why, 2,400 years after Socrates drank the cup, we still tell the story, still warn against the danger, still remember the plant that silenced philosophy's greatest voice, yet could not silence philosophy itself. Thank you for joining me on this long, dark journey through the history of hemlock. If you found this exploration valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these deep dives into history possible. And remember, if you see a plant with white flowers and umbrella clusters, purple spotted hollow stems, and finely divided leaves, a plant that smells wrong when you crush it, leave it alone. Some knowledge is worth preserving. And sometimes the most important knowledge is simply knowing what not to touch. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.